What's happening, fam? L.A.R. movement still moving. Book is entitled Lessons from a Non-Custodial Father at Amazon, Kindle, and Create Space. The link will be in the description box below. As usual, go get it. PayPal link there also. They asked me to put it up, so I put it up. Thanks for supporting. But this video, though, this video is entitled 90s and 2000 athletes are better than 2010s athletes. Here's the thing. I watch sports, and I remember 80s, 90s, and 2000s, and in 2010s. What I've noticed is it's peaked and declined. In the 80s, you had great athletes, but a lot of times they didn't take their jobs, their craft as seriously as they should have. You know, so they were great athletes, but if you look at them, all of them wasn't in shape all the time, even when they were professionals. That was a thing about the 80s where you could be great, but you probably not in your best shape. So the competition was, you can, the greatness kind of was like See, by the 90s, being in shape and being, and everybody being at their best physical peak performance level was normal. It was normal. Like, people who changed the tide of that, I would say would be like people like Bo Jackson changed the tide of that. Michael Jordan actually changed the tide of that. Jerry Rice changed the tide of that. You get what I'm saying? Like, when you saw, you know, you could be great just as an athlete, but if you actually committed to it, you can just take it through the roof. And that's what happened. You saw people who were in the 80s take it seriously and just went to an extreme level in the 90s. But by the 90s, you had to come in like that. You know, as a matter of fact, if you came in too small, it was like, you're going to have to put on some weight. This is a man's game. You know, if you came in too slow, you better figure it out, because these boys ain't playing. So they were the best. The 90s had the best athletes because at that particular time, and you had a lot of guys in the 90s who played multiple sports. You know, like Will Chamberlain back in the day played basketball and volleyball, beach volleyball. Jim Brown played football and lacrosse in college. But what you wind up with in the 90s, I saw more of, you know, a guy was playing basketball, football, baseball, track, wrestling, and they were and they chose their best sport. Kind of like Frank Thomas and Dave Winfield. They both played football in college, but they chose baseball, you know, because it lasted longer. But in the 90s, you saw guys who were like Ronaldo Nehemiah, kind of was a blueprint of that too. You saw guys, I ran track, I'm gonna play some football. I wrestled, I'm gonna be a linebacker or running back. You know what I'm saying? I'm a basketball player, I'm gonna do this, that, and the third. This is how you got all these quote unquote hybrid type players. Because they were good at multiple sports, and they brought their IQ in sports from one position in one sport to the next position in another sport. This is why they kept saying certain positions in certain sports translate to each other. Playing an outfield in baseball is like playing safety. Those positions translate. You get what I'm saying? Tight end, forward, that translate. Linebacker, running back, being a wrestler, that translates. Being a wide receiver, DB, boxing, because of boxing, karate, judo, the hand part of that translates. Okay? So these guys were actually better because they were more well-rounded athletes. They weren't specialists. This is why this is where that prototypical stuff started breaking down, because the prototypical thing was a specialist. You started seeing people who just were something completely out breaking the mold in the 90s and the 2000s. Completely different athletes. You're like, what? You know, the domination in the 90s and 2000s. Huge. Culminate the beginning that to showing how dominant it was. The only 1992 USA Dream Team. That let the world know in a basketball sense how far behind you actually were. That Olympic team, with most of the players from the 80s, you know, who and some of them transcended into the 90s. But that those teams, that team there was blowing people out 30, 40, 50. Not like nothing. Nothing. Okay. So it set the bar real high. In the 90s, in the 2000s, the college atmosphere was more competitive. As a matter of fact, the high school atmosphere was more competitive. And what I mean by that is, your reputation had to precede you, but your game had to match that. So you had to have a good reputation in the streets or in these competitions. Then you had to have a good reputation with your team, with your division, and then city and statewide. You had to meet expectations every week. So in the 90s and the 2000s, guys knew they had to come with it every time. Was no night off. There was no I ain't feeling it tonight. There was no I'm sick. None of that. You're going to have to figure it out. If this ain't working in your game today, you're going to have to adjust. All people care about is excitement, wins and losses. That's it. But as it evolved, if you could get enough buzz to sell tickets, you was good enough. This is why in the 90s and the 2000s, there were a lot of guys who were hyped up. But when you put them in a room with a bunch of other people, they would get their jobs took, whether it be in college or the professional leagues. Because either they were just more hype than actual skill, or they packed it in and got comfortable. 90s and 2000s, you couldn't get comfortable. This is part of the reason why I said 2010s are not as good. Because you can get comfortable now. You can come in and kind of be okay. And in 2010s, they getting rid of people who are good and productive because they ain't feeling them no more. And they're allowing people who aren't good and productive to just be around. That didn't happen in the 90s and the 2000s. Either you could produce or you couldn't. You could have been producing on a declining scale, but you were still producing. If you were in year 10, 12, 15, and you're producing at a declining scale, but you're producing better than the guy at 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7, that guy ain't playing. That is just as simple as that. You declining is better than him. Is better than him going up. That's where it's at right now. You had to take that spot. You didn't just get anointed. The athletes were better. See, when people compare athletes in the 90s, 2000s, and 2010s, there's no comparison. You never seen anything like Roy Jones Jr. since. The longevity of a Bernard Hopkins. Are we going to see that? I don't know. People forget. Floyd started in the 90s. All the guys who ensued were in the 90s and the 2000s. Have you seen a Barry Sanders type player yet? Absolutely not. Seen a Deion Sanders yet? Absolutely not. How about Champ Bailey? Absolutely not. You get what I'm saying? You know, Peyton Manning's cool. Anybody, but when I talked about their prototype, Mike Vick, whoa, slow down. Like, you didn't see that before. Athletes were freakish, like Javon Curse, freakish. You know what I'm saying? Now, I will say in the 90s and 2000s, you had a lot of guys who had a shorter window of greatness. But let's bring into, you seen a Randy Moss or a T.O.? You see that in the league right now? Steve Smith, Chad Johnson, you see that in the league right now? Tell me. Tell me. You see somebody as consistent as Curtis Martin right now? Year in and year out? Somebody freakishly big like Steven Jackson? No, you ain't see that, huh? The fact that Kurt Warner is a Hall of Famer? Terrell Davis, when he was smoking? Oh, different animal. That was the other thing. The 90s and the 2000s, they understood athletes. Some who were good in college would be great in the professionals because their game wasn't made for college. It was made for the pros. They had the skill set for the pros. That's why Terrell Davis was like, whew. They said it when he was at Georgia. He's good, but he's actually going to be a better pro. Because this ain't, you know, he was too much for that game. His game was too much for that. So it made it look bad. But they knew it was there. Curtis Martin was a killer in college. People forget about Robert Edwards. Look at all sports. When did Venus and Serena start? You think you're going to see the athletes in those eras seem to be hungrier. They had more competition. They had more to prove. And they had to do it year in and year out. And the pressure was mounting. Because at the top of the scale was, you got to remember who was the faces of sports back then in the 90s and 2000s. Jordan. Let's see. Montana was on his way out. So I can't say Montana. But Jordan, for sure. Ken Griffey. Barry Bonds at a time. Mike Tyson was still the face, but Oscar De La Hoya actually was taking that spot. But then he got knocked off by Sugar Shane in boxing and all that. But Roy Jones had the 90s, just hands down. Deion Sanders, these were the faces. To be a face, you had to be this good and this dominant. To be a household name like a Warren Sapp or John Randall or Randy Moss, you had to be that dominant, or Charles Woodson, you had to be that dominant. And that's different with the 2010s. We're talking about an era where people will play offense to a high level and defense to a high level. In every sport, you had to be good all around the board. You don't have to be like that in 2010s. You know, J.J. Redick, Steve Kerr, Craig Hodges, spot-up shooters. They were really role players or bench players. You know, if you play football, if you can only specialize in one thing, you had to go. You only came in at a certain time. Other than that, you got to go because you need to be good all across the board. And people, you know, from the 90s and 2000s, they changed position a lot. They changed positions a lot. People forget that. People forget a lot. This is part of the thing about college now, where a lot of these guys, they were forced to be something other than what they were. So their skill set changed along the way. This is where you get some of your greatest athletes even today. They were something else in high school. And they wound up being something else in college. And it changed who they were. You know, so I'm done with this one. And you can pick athletes from the 2010s, drafted in the 2010s, and versus athletes who was drafted in the 2000s and the 90s, or people who, you know, drafted late 80s and played through most of the 90s, and look at them. Look at the guys from the 2010s now, and some of them from the late 2000s up to the 2010s. Look at how they just weren't really up to snuff. So tell me what you think. We out. Peace.